Slowly, I became aware of my surroundings as my thoughts began to emerge from the fog in my mind. The ominous twilight of my basement workshop, illuminated only by the light from the slightly open door, reflected my mood. One of the rackets I had been working on earlier was still clamped in a vise on the workbench. I could hear our two youngest daughters playing on the other side of the partition in the playroom, and I could hear the sounds of the Disney movie they were watching on the VCR. Sitting in my old beat-up chair, I glanced at the clock on the wall. I had been sitting here for more than half an hour. My thoughts were spinning in circles, not moving, not seeing, not understanding what I didn't want to hear. Sunday night dinner was over. My wife Sally was cleaning the kitchen and doing the dishes while I went down to my workshop to grab some of my rackets for the upcoming fall racquetball tournaments. I had been a keen gamer for 7 or 8 years, playing several morning matches a week before going to work as an engineer at GM. I also participated in at least one evening league every fall, winter, and spring. I was proud that in a relatively short period of time I achieved good success and always played in the A category. And several times a year I participated in local tournaments, usually finishing in first place. Playing racquetball regularly helped me maintain a weight of about 200 pounds on my 6'2" frame. Our 7-year-old daughter, Jessie, followed me downstairs to watch her favorite movie in the playroom, and our youngest, 4-year-old Ellie, followed. Ellie was at the age where Jessie couldn't go anywhere without Ellie wanting to go with her. We're lucky that Jessie hasn't been annoyed by it yet. I feared the day when she would grow up, and that would change. Our 9-year-old son Jason was already aware that he was a boy and the eldest in the family, so he should not play with his younger sisters. Most likely, he was in his room, building or playing with model airplanes and cars. By the time I was done with the grips on 3 rackets, which I kept in my gym bag, I noticed that the string tension on a couple of them needed adjusting. Murphy's Law worked the string will definitely break at least once a week in the middle of a match. I looked into the playroom. The girls were in the middle of watching Lady and the Tramp, and I decided to go upstairs. As I walked up the stairs in my socks and got closer to the slightly open basement door, I heard Sally's soft voice talking on the phone. The thought occurred to me that maybe I could sneak up on her and play a little prank. I was thinking about setting the mood for something more later, even though we had already had our usual mattress time the morning before. Approaching the door, I looked through the crack to see where she was. Perfect, I grinned happily. Sally leaned her elbows on the kitchen counter with her back to me, wearing tight jeans and holding the phone to her ear. Her blouse was untucked and hanging down, and I could see her bare stomach and the slightest hint of a bra. Her red hair was pulled back into a ponytail that bounced up and down when she spoke. Even after 3 children and 10 years of marriage, Sally remained attractive. She was approximately 5 feet 6 inches tall and kept her weight around 130 pounds through regular exercise and healthy eating. With age and maturity, her curves became softer, but she was even sexier than when we got married. She was 23 and I was only a year older. Kids may have slowed our sexual rhythm over the years, but we always made time for each other a couple times a week. Now the sight of her magnificent pear-shaped butt and long, slender legs was beginning to cause a certain reaction in me. As I slowly opened the door wider, I began to hear part of the conversation taking place on the phone. "Scheduled for Tuesday and Thursday from 9 to 3, I heard. There was a small silence as she listened to the other person. "Yes, I can talk. Phil is in the basement with the girls." "Why?" "Yes, I think so too, Debbie. I've been thinking about this a lot lately. Next weekend. I don't think we have anything planned. Perhaps I can." "Yeah, now I understand." She was talking to her friend and boss, Debbie Bradshaw. They seemed to be discussing another one of their regular shopping trips that happened 3 or 4 times a year. I slowly opened the door wider and started to go out to quickly pounce on the prize that was beckoning to me, but suddenly I stopped, puzzled by a strange sound. Sally giggled. "What the hell?" Then she giggled again, listening to something Debbie said. It amazed me that I couldn't remember Sally giggling like that after our honeymoon. Then she lowered her voice, and I could hear. I'd like to try this again before the wart is removed. Suddenly, this comment reminded me of a conversation I witnessed a couple of months ago at a bar. I felt dizzy and weak. I quietly walked back to the basement steps and slowly almost closed the door behind me. When I did this, Sally continued to laugh and almost whisper into the phone. I could only hear isolated words. Last time, I really liked it. I know, I know. Yeah, both. Tell him what we'll see. Yeah, no, I can wait. I was standing in the darkness of the staircase when she began to end the conversation. Suddenly, I didn't want her to know I was there, so I quietly turned and walked back down the stairs and staggered back to my workshop. I collapsed into a chair, thinking about the conversation that came to mind. This happened last spring after one of the last matches in our Wednesday evening racquetball league. A few of us went to the bar after the game for a couple of beers, as we did about once a month. An hour later, it was just me, John Harrison, and Craig Davis. John and Craig were best friends and joined the Y in Oak Park just a couple of years ago. John was a heavy beer drinker, but Craig only drank soft drinks. I eventually found out that he was an alcoholic and had quit drinking several years ago. From what I heard, the only problem with his alcoholism was that after a couple of beers he couldn't have sex, which apparently irritated his wife. But he still loved going to bars and always joined the group when possible. Both were married. John had 2 children. Craig had 1. As usual, after discussing the matches, for a while the conversations and jokes turned to the topic of sex and women. After a dozen times in a bar with these two, I realized that they had no principles about cheating, and a couple of times they showed unusual interest in my marriage and my sex life, which made me feel uncomfortable. On at least one occasion, I left after 1 glass of beer to avoid the topic. That evening, Craig teased John about his wife, Mary. She insisted that he undergo a surgical procedure of a very personal nature. I thought it was about not having children and said that Sally had also talked about me making her so she could stop taking the pills. But we haven't come to an agreement yet. Craig just continued to grin and John had this pained expression on his face. "Oh no, she wants him to remove the wart," Craig said with an almost strangled laugh. Surprised, I said, "I think I've lost the thread of the conversation. What are you talking about?" John blushed slightly, but explained that since adolescence he had had a common, very simple wart on his private part. He admitted that over the past couple of years, the wart had grown and it had begun to cause concern to his wife. His wife, Mary, insisted that it should be removed. It seemed to me that John was less concerned that his wife might lose pleasure than that he would lose the advantage he had in seducing other women. Apparently, his wart often became a topic of discussion and aroused some curiosity when he tried to persuade women other than his wife into bed. It was around this point that I realized the conversation was getting too deep for me and decided to leave. Now I sat in the dark, thinking about that conversation. I just couldn't believe that Sally could be involved in anything that her phone conversation suggested. Sally knew that John and Craig were the ones I played racquetball with. I've talked about them a few times before, and their names were usually on the match schedules I kept with our calendar. But as far as I knew, they had never met. However, no matter how hard I tried to deny it, my thoughts continued to form a single picture. I had a terrible feeling that I didn't know anything, and I started to sweat. I just couldn't believe Sally would do something like that, and desperately hoped there was some reasonable explanation. And whatever was going on, it looks like Debbie was involved too. Sally's boss, Debbie Bradshaw, became assistant manager of the store where Sally worked about 5 years ago. She transferred from the company's headquarters somewhere in the Detroit area. She previously worked at the same store right after college before heading to the big city to take management training. Debbie was married to Josh, an accountant whom she met while working in Detroit. Sally mentioned that Josh was her second husband. Sally and Debbie were close in age and became close when Sally was pregnant with Ellie. Debbie was pregnant at the same time with her daughter Shannon, their first and only child. Both children were born within a month of each other, which brought Debbie and Sally even closer. We've interacted with Debbie and Josh a few times over the years, usually at some work event related to Sally and Debbie. We didn't belong to the same social circles and were probably a step down financially. Debbie was a smart, beautiful blonde with green eyes, but it always seemed to me that she should be the center of attention. Josh seemed like a nice guy, but I always thought his main focus was on his work. John and Craig joined a racquetball league at the IMCA about 2 years ago. John owned a construction business and Craig was the managing partner of a home building company. His father-in-law was the senior partner. We were all about the same age, married and had families, so we had a lot in common. But strangely enough, the only time we interacted was during racquetball games or on the rare occasions when we would go out for a couple of beers after a game. Our families have never met. As often happens, when you start communicating with new people, you discover that you have mutual friends and acquaintances. One day, when I mentioned the store where Sally worked, John said he knew someone who worked there. It turned out it was Debbie Bradshaw. Debbie graduated from the same school as John and Craig, but a year later than them. He said they cross paths a couple of times a year. The shopping trips started about 2 years ago when our youngest, Ellie, was going through her terrible 2 years. Sally had a particularly difficult time with Ellie for several months. Jessie went to kindergarten, so she was only home half the day. Trying to take care of 3 kids, take care of the house, and work a couple days a week takes its toll. Exhausted, I couldn't help her much since I was working overtime every week on the project I was assigned. It got to the point that one night, when everyone had already gone to bed, she collapsed on the sofa and began to sob from disappointment and fatigue. I hugged her and just held her until she calmed down. We talked about the situation, and she complained that if she could just get a break sometimes, it would be easier for her. I was so sorry that I couldn't be there for her the way she deserved that I offered to take full responsibility for the children the following weekend if she wanted to rest. She tearfully thanked me and said she would think about it. A couple of weeks later, Sally said she had talked to Debbie about needing some time away from the kids. Debbie suggested going shopping together and visiting several high-end shopping centers in the suburbs of Detroit. Debbie was sure her husband wouldn't mind. Despite my reservations about taking her out with a credit card to high-end stores, I agreed. So the next free weekend, Sally and Debbie left on Saturday morning for Detroit. They stopped for breakfast along the way, then visited one of the shopping centers. In the afternoon, they checked into a hotel, had dinner, then went to the cinema. Before leaving, I insisted that Sally call me immediately after checking in and give me the phone number and room number where she was staying, which she did. The next day they checked out, had breakfast, and went to another shopping center before finally returning home around 5 p.m. Sally was so grateful for the trip that as soon as she walked through the door, she hugged and kissed me tightly and talked non-stop about the shops and restaurants. The sex was wonderful that night. She didn't spend too much money, but she bought some nice things for herself and the children. I was happy for her, and besides, the kids were pretty well behaved, so I had no complaints. This happened more than 2 years ago. Since then, shopping trips have become regular. Every 3 or 4 months, they departed on Saturday morning and returned late on Sunday. I didn't mind. I enjoyed spending time alone with the children, and this seemed to make Sally happy. I was trying to remember if there was anything unusual or if anything had changed since the trip started. I remembered that the second time she went, she came back in a completely different mood than after the first trip. For some reason, she seemed thoughtful, sad, and maybe a little nervous. I mentioned it that night and asked what happened. She replied that nothing had happened, but that she had started her women's days, and I knew that she sometimes gets depressed at this time. Of course, there was no sex that night. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that after that first trip, we never made love the night she returned, or for a few days after that. But there was always sex a few days before she left, and every time, in the week preceding the trip, Sally was always in high spirits, almost in seventh heaven. I didn't think much about it before, but now I do. About that moment, I heard Sally call to me from the top of the stairs, "Phil, it's time for the girls to go swimming. Can you send them upstairs?" I just sat there, trying to get my thoughts in order. Phil, Phil, can you hear me? I got up from my chair, walked to the foot of the stairs, and shouted to her irritably, "Yes, I heard you. I will bring them." I went into the playroom and, despite their protests, kicked the girls upstairs. After they left, I started packing up my things, putting them in their places, mostly just to kill time. I needed to put my thoughts in order and not allow the emotions raging inside me to manifest themselves. Finally, I could no longer stall and went upstairs. Sally was leafing through a cookbook in the kitchen when I walked through the door. She turned to me, put her arms around my neck, and kissed me passionately before I could react. She pulled away and, smiling, looked into my eyes. "Is something wrong, dear? You seemed irritated to me." Feeling awkward, I muttered something about finding a crack in one of my favorite rackets. But I continued to look into her eyes, trying to see at least something that would confirm my suspicions. But there was nothing there. She was just Sally, the woman I loved. She laughed and kissed me again. Then she hesitated a little and said, "Debbie called while you were downstairs. She wanted to know if we could go shopping next weekend." When she said this, her eyes narrowed, and it seemed as if a curtain had fallen between us. As I looked at her, she blinked and looked away. At that moment, I realized that she was hiding something, and I thought, how long has this been going on? Desperately trying to think of a way to put this trip on hold until I could figure something out, I awkwardly said, don't we have something planned for next weekend?" "There's nothing on the calendar," she replied. "I think we have some kind of WFW event scheduled for Saturday night. I thought we could go," I said slowly. Sally pulled away from me and looked at me appraisingly. "Phil, you know that I don't like going to such events. I don't care if your father goes there too. All you do there is talk about the army and drink too much. I'm bored to death by this, so if you want to go, just find a babysitter while I'm gone." "Then why don't we spend time with the kids this weekend? Cedar Point will only be open for a few more weeks before it closes for the season, and we haven't taken Ellie there yet. She's old enough to like it," I said, clutching at straws. Sally frowned and her face began to turn red, as it does on the rare occasions when she gets really angry. "We just took the kids to Mackinac Island for Labor Day. This was just a couple of weeks ago. What's wrong with you, Phil? You've never objected to me going shopping before." I also started to get angry and, keeping a straight face, said, "Forget it. I just thought we could do something together. You and Debbie have fun. I'll go upstairs and see if the kids have gone to bed." I turned and headed up the stairs to the bedrooms. Halfway up, I glanced down and saw Sally looking at me strangely. I managed to avoid serious conversation with her for the rest of the evening. Like most work nights, I went to bed before Sally and lay there trying to sleep. After some time, I heard her enter the room and go to our bathroom to change into her pajamas. She slid into bed. She hugged me and whispered, "Phil, Phil." I continued to breathe evenly and pretended to be asleep. She finally gave up and moved away from me. I could tell by her breathing when she finally fell asleep. I rolled over onto my back and stared at the ceiling, trying to sort out my thoughts. My thoughts went back, and I started thinking about my life and how I got to this point. I grew up less than 20 miles from where we lived now, in the most ordinary middle-class family: mom, dad, me, and my older sister. The most interesting thing about my childhood was my best friend Jason, or Jace, as everyone usually called him. His family lived at one end of the block and ours at the other. We met around 4th grade and have been inseparable ever since. If he wasn't at our house, then I was at his. Hardly a week went by without one of us spending the night at the other's house. He was Mr. Personality, always joking, laughing, rarely taking anything seriously, and always making friends wherever he went. I was the calmer, thoughtful type. We complemented each other. As we grew older, we played sports together, began to notice girls together, and even often went on dates together. We weren't exceptional students, but I usually got better grades than Jace. At school, I discovered one thing I really liked: drafting. By the time I was a senior in high school, I had taken every drafting course I could, and was seriously considering becoming an engineer. After high school, I decided to attend a local college that had an engineering technology program. It was relatively inexpensive and close enough to live at home and commute to classes. Jace didn't know what he wanted to do, but he came with me and signed up for general courses. The main advantage of this was that we received a student deferment from military conscription. Then, towards the end of my freshman year, I screwed up big time. Jace and I were at a college party one Saturday night when I got pulled over on my way back home. I failed a breathalyzer test and spent the night in the county jail. Mom and Dad pulled me out the next day, and they were rightfully outraged. I ended up using all my savings to pay fines, legal fees, and court costs, and lost my driver's license for a year. I was gloomy for the rest of the semester, hitchhiking to class with Jace. Finally, I thought, the hell with it. I was left without money and without rights, and I had no motivation to continue my studies next year. I decided to take a risk and enlist in the Army. I hoped that with my background in drafting, I could get an engineering job and avoid Vietnam. At least that's what the recruiter told me. Of course he lied. When I told Jace about my plans, he immediately decided to join me. The recruiter said that we could go through the program for friends and were guaranteed to go through training together. So we set off. The basic training was difficult but bearable. Halfway through the course, we took a series of aptitude tests for different military specialties. The Army, with its infinite intelligence, decided that we would be best suited to work as fire control specialists. The job involved operating what the Army called a fire control computer, but it was actually a beefed-up calculator that calculated distances, azimuths, and the amount of explosive required for an artillery shell to hit a given target. After basic training, we were sent to Fort Sill to learn a new profession. Fort Sill wasn't the most pleasant place, but Jace and I managed to have some fun. However, this was nothing compared to the next gift. We received orders to go to Vietnam, which arrived a couple of weeks before graduation. After a 15-day vacation, visiting my parents, having beers with our old friends, and chasing a few of our ex-girlfriends, we took the long flight to First Corps, Republic of Vietnam. After some paperwork, we were both assigned to Battery A, 2nd Division, 11th Artillery Brigade. It was November 1969, and Nixon had already begun drawing down troop levels as part of a strategy to transfer the war to South Vietnam. What a ridiculous plan this was. We didn't see much fighting in the first 5 or 6 months. We fired at many targets from various emplacements throughout the First Corps, but only came under fire a couple of times. The most memorable moment of our tour so far was getting away to Bangkok, Thailand. After 15 days of prostitutes and strong drinks, Jace and I returned to our unit exhausted and hoping to rest. The news that our unit was seconded to the 3rd Brigade of the 101st Airborne Division did not generate much comment while we were away. But a couple of days later, when our battery was transferred to a bare hill in the heart of the jungle, I felt a bad feeling. 4 months later, I returned home on a stretcher. Jace came back dead. I was severely traumatized physically and mentally. I spent several weeks in the hospital and a couple of months in rehabilitation. I also saw a psychiatrist to try to cope with what happened. After doctors declared me partially fit for duty, I was sent back to Fort Sill to join the training brigade, where I became an assistant instructor. I didn't really like talking to anyone, so I took classes at the local college and spent my free time drafting. A year later, I applied for early demobilization to return to school. As the Vietnam War came to an end, the Army was also thinning its ranks. I was accepted into an engineering technology program at the university closest to home. The Army approved my request, and I was discharged 5 months early after 2 years and 7 months of service. I moved back in with my parents and applied for veterans benefits. Living at home, my needs were minimal. I saved most of the money I made in Vietnam. Education benefits and income from my part-time job covered all my expenses. Looking back, I realized that I was a typical, if not stereotypical, Vietnam soldier who survived combat. The public reaction to the war, and to those of us who fought in it, coupled with my injuries and what I saw and did, made me an embittered, withdrawn recluse. I grew my hair and beard. I wore a hoodie and wore my old beat-up army jacket most of the time. Worn jeans and scuffed sneakers completed my look. I went to university, to work and home. I know Mom, Dad, and my sister Terry were worried about me, but I just didn't feel socially engaged in life anymore. I still saw a therapist at the Department of Veterans Affairs once a month, but that didn't help much. Once a week, I would visit Jace's parents, and we would talk about him and how great it was to spend time together. They seemed to enjoy it, and it was the least I could do for them. One afternoon, I was sitting in the reading room of the International Center on campus. Several times a week, I had a couple of hours between classes, and I usually spent that time studying or reading. I tried to ignore the noise around me when a voice interrupted my thoughts. "Can I sit here?" I looked up at the man standing on the other side of the table and was stunned. Long red hair and flawless pale skin that can only be seen on a true redhead. Curious brown eyes looked at me, waiting for an answer. I licked my lips nervously as I looked at her perfect scarlet lips. I was lost in these thoughts when she repeated her question. "Do you mind if I sit here?" Having difficulty finding the power of speech, I squeezed out, No, sit down." While she was arranging her books and pushing back her chair to sit down, I looked at her out of the corner of my eye. She was 7 or 8 inches shorter than my 6-foot height and weighed about 120 pounds, beautifully built. For the next half hour, she was immersed in her books, while I pretended to be engrossed in mine. From time to time, I stole glances at her, admiring her appearance. After I did this for the 5th or 6th time, I looked up and saw her looking at me. She pointed to my army jacket and asked, slightly hesitantly, "Are you a veteran?" I nodded. Then she clarified, "Vietnam." I flinched when I heard this, since often the reaction to such a question was not the most pleasant. But I just said, "Yes," and left it at that. A few minutes later, she said joyfully, "My father is a veteran. He served in the Korean War. He was a Marine." I relaxed a little, thinking that maybe it wasn't so bad. She then added, "He was even injured." She said it like it was some small thing. "Civilians," I thought with disgust. But he simply nodded and explained that I spent almost 3 years in the army, but tried to avoid mentioning Vietnam. We started talking and talked until she said that she had to go to class. She collected her books, said goodbye, and left. I was sorry that she left. She was the first woman I'd actually spoken to since I'd gotten home. A couple of days later, I was sitting in almost the same place again when I heard a familiar voice. "Hey, can I sit here?" This time I answered more coherently than the first time. I tried to immerse myself in my book, but she started talking to me as if we were best friends. After a while, she suddenly stopped and, blushing slightly, said, "I just realized that I've been chatting incessantly, and I don't even know your name." A little embarrassed, I extended my hand and said, "My name is Phil Robinson." She laughed and said, "Sally Baxter. Nice to meet you." It turned out that we both had a lot of free time between classes every Wednesday, Monday, and Friday. Over the next couple of weeks, we often spent this time together talking. She told me almost her whole life, about her mother, father, older sisters, friends, plans for her career and study. In addition to being beautiful, she was outgoing, cheerful, and friendly. Her personality reminded me a lot of Jace. I noticed that I started sharing stories with her about my family and school, but didn't talk too much about the past. I avoided questions about the army. To be honest, I liked listening to her more. She could read the phone book to me, and I would still listen. I was completely fascinated by her. Somehow, she managed to bring me out of my state of apathy and made me interested in something other than studying. After our second meeting, I noticed that I started shaving in the morning for the first time in weeks. After the third or fourth meeting, I even went and got my hair cut and started dressing less casually. Mom immediately noticed the changes and started asking questions. Shyly, I admitted that I had met someone who interested me. She made fun of me, but I saw that she was happy. A few weeks after we met, I plucked up the courage to ask her out. She looked pleased and immediately said yes. Like me, she lived at home and traveled to classes. When she agreed for me to pick her up on Friday night, she said with a laugh, "I warn you, my dad can be strict with people who ask me out. Are you sure you're ready for this?" I looked her straight in the eyes and said, "Sally, I think that in order to spend the evening with you, I'm willing to put up with your father." And I thought to myself, and I'm ready for life too. She blushed and said, "Oh, what a flatterer." I began to realize that she blushed easily. On Friday evening, I knocked on her door, and a woman with a warm smile answered the door. Before I could even say anything, she said, "You must be Phil. We've been waiting for you. Please come in." She took me by the hand and led me into the house. While she was doing this, she called over her shoulder, "Jack, Sally's boyfriend has arrived." Then she turned to me and said kindly, "Don't worry about Sally's father. He's not as scary as she says. By the way, my name is Emily." And she shook the hand she was still holding. I didn't know how to react when her father came out of the kitchen. He was a big man, about my height, but obviously 30 pounds heavier. I weigh 180 pounds. Not thick, but rather strong. "I'm Jack," he said in a deep voice and extended his hand to me, looking at me intently. "Phil Robinson," I replied, shaking his hand firmly. "Let's go into the living room and talk for a few minutes while Sally finishes," he suggested. The three of us walked through the kitchen into a cozy, wood-paneled room. There was a TV in the corner. Next to it, there was a sofa and a couple of armchairs. One wall of the room was occupied by a fireplace and a shelf that stretched along the entire wall. On one side of the shelf sat a triangular wooden box with a neatly folded American flag. On the other side of the shelf was a wooden box with a glass front, the kind I've seen in stores on military bases. These boxes were used to display military mementos, insignia, ribbons, and medals. Between these two boxes, on a pedestal, lay an M1 Garand rifle. With a shiny butt and a carefully polished belt, she looked very impressive. A framed USANC flag hung above the rifle. All this made a very impressive impression. Jack noticed me looking at the mantle and said proudly, "I served in Korea as a Marine. I would have remained in service, but I was wounded during the breakout from Pusan and again during the retreat from the Chosin Reservoir. After that, I didn't pass the medical examination." I nodded and said, "Yes, Sally mentioned that. Tough times." "Sally says you're a Vietnam veteran," Jack continued as we all sat down. "Yeah, been there for a while," I said, feeling uncomfortable. "What were you doing there?" "I was a fire control specialist in an artillery battery, 155, I replied. He nodded in agreement. 155 are the workhorses of artillery. What part of Vietnam did you serve in?" Emily chimed in, "Sorry to Jack, he's a bit of a military history geek. He follows all the news about the war." "I understand," I replied. "Our battery was located in different places in the First Corps." Jack looked at me strangely, as if he couldn't decide whether I was a real soldier like him or just some kind of coward from the rear. But then the Marines never really respected the soldiers. First Corps, huh? This was Marine territory. Well, by the time I got there, almost all the Marines had already been taken out. Jack snorted, "Yes, Vietnamization, a wonderful term that means, take this country, it's yours." "Jack, the war isn't over yet," Emily interjected. "It's over. All you have to do is wait for the screams. You'll see for yourself," he insisted, looking at her. I breathed a sigh of relief when Sally entered the room at that moment. It was obvious that this conversation could go on forever, and I didn't want to talk about Vietnam. We talked for a few minutes about school and what we were going to do that evening, then said goodbye and left. That evening, we went to dinner and a movie. To be honest, I didn't remember much from that evening, as I was completely engrossed in our conversation. We held hands in the cinema and sat close, almost touching our heads. After the movie, we both didn't want to leave, so we stopped at a bar for one cocktail. I walked her to the door just a few minutes before she told her parents she would be back. standing there awkwardly, wanting to touch her, kiss her, but afraid of ruining the evening. I hesitated, but she took the initiative, looked into my eyes and whispered, "Thank you, Phil, for a wonderful evening." Time stood still as I looked into her deep brown eyes. I swore I could see her soul. Everything she is and everything she will ever become was completely open to me. At that moment, I realized that I loved her. I hugged her and kissed her. Reluctantly, she pulled away and entered the house. The next day, I called her and we talked for an hour. We agreed on a new date for the middle of the week, and from that moment on, we became an exclusive couple. A few weeks later, I plucked up the courage to tell her that I had rented a motel room for the following Saturday. She blushed as usual, but then simply smiled and nodded. The evening was something one could only dream of. There were a few awkward moments when she saw the scars Vietnam left on me, but I assured her that the doctors had put everything back together and I was doing great. Quietly, I said in her ear, "Sally, I love you. I know maybe you don't want to hear this yet, but I can't help myself." Sally raised her head and looked at me. I saw tears shining in her eyes, and her lips curved into a smile. "I love you too, Phil. I never knew this could be like this." I laughed with relief and kissed the tip of her nose. "I don't know about forever, but I do know that I want to do this again and again." She laughed. "God, Phil, whatever you want, everything." For the first time since I lost Jace, I felt at peace. Life has found meaning. I realized that I have a future with someone I love and who loves me back. By the time we left the motel, tired in the early morning hours, we knew we wanted to be together for the rest of our lives. That night, we discussed everything: sex, marriage, children, where we wanted to live, what we wanted to do. Although Sally was a year younger than me, she was a year older in school. She was supposed to graduate at the end of this spring, and I was supposed to graduate in a year. We decided that Sally would work after graduation, and we would get married right after I graduated. In the meantime, I'll rent an apartment so we can be together. A week later, I brought Sally to my parents. My father, Dave, worked as a toolmaker for GM. My mother, Donna, had been a part-time teacher's aide since my sister and I were in high school. Sally hit it off with my parents straight away. Mom later said that they not only loved Sally for who she was, but also because she brought me out of my shell. And I really have changed. I was happy. Most of the time I couldn't stop smiling. It got to the point where the next time I went to see my therapist, he kicked me out of the office and told me not to come back. Relations with Sally's father, Jack, remained wary. I'm sure he was worried about the man who had captured his youngest daughter's heart. The fact that we were close didn't help either. The look on his face when we started talking about moving in together before marriage was scary. But everything changed a couple of months later when Jack and Emily invited us to dinner. After dinner, Jack and I went into his office while Sally and her mom put away food and talked in the kitchen. After a few minutes of talking about this and that, Jack became thoughtful and then asked, "Sally says you have significant scars from Vietnam. She asked me what could have caused them." I looked away, feeling embarrassed for some reason. "Yeah, it's not something I like to talk about, especially with her." Jack smiled and said, "I understand. Civilians often don't understand." After a short pause, he added, "Phil, when we met, you made it clear that you didn't see much combat there, right?" Reluctantly, I replied, "Not really, until the last firing line I was on." After a moment of silence, he asked, "What was that milestone?" I thought again, "Ripcord." Jack's eyes suddenly opened wide. "Ripcord? Have you been to Ripcord?" I nodded. "Summer of '70? He asked with noticeable tension in his voice. He nodded again. I was a little surprised he'd even heard of Ripcord. The Army tried to minimize any news about the battle due to the high number of casualties. This was not difficult since President Nixon was campaigning in Cambodia at the same time. At this point, Sally and her mother returned to the office, and the conversation turned to the topics of school and Sally's upcoming graduation. Jack and I never spoke about it again, but from that moment on he began to treat me like the son he never had. After this, events began to develop quite quickly. Sally graduated with honors. She got a well-paying job as an assistant purchasing manager at a retail chain near us. She tried to spend as much time as possible with me in my apartment. However, her parents insisted that she not move to me before the wedding. I completed the program on time and found a job at General Motors as a draftsman before I even received my degree. We got married 2 months later. With our combined incomes, we were able to afford a small Cape Cod-style home on a lot large enough to allow for an addition if necessary. A year later, our son Jason was born. Named after my best friend, he was truly a miracle. 2 years later, we had Jesse. At that moment, we thought that was it. But after some thought, we decided to have another child, and 3 years after Jesse, Ellie was born. And although it was especially nice to have a son, it was the girls who literally held me in their little hands. Sally went part-time and got a job in retail when Jason was born. She wanted to work at least part-time between children and eventually return to full-time work once all the children were in school. She was currently working 12 to 20 hours a week. This was beneficial as she was entitled to a significant employee discount, which was especially useful considering how much money was spent on clothing for the children. My work has gradually evolved since I started. At the very beginning, I was involved in translating design drawings into programs to create control codes for automated manufacturing. And by the time Ellie was born, we had already seen the first computer-aided design systems, and the company chose me to be part of the group that received training for their very first implementation. Life was good. The money was enough to afford 2 cars and a modest but beautiful house. We built an extension, adding a bedroom, a bathroom, and completed a playroom between the children's berths. We had 3 beautiful and healthy children. We spent a lot of time together as a family. At least once a year we went on a family vacation, and twice a year Sally and I sent the kids to their grandparents for a long weekend, just the 2 of us. I always thought our marriage was strong. Our sex life was frequent and varied. Sally was always a willing and enthusiastic partner. We were not shy about confessing our love to each other. We hugged, held hands, and touched each other often. I looked at her, then at the wives of other men, and thought how lucky I was, and often told her about it. I always believed that we were still as much in love and attracted to each other as we were 10 years ago. Now I wasn't so sure about it. I felt like my life was falling apart. At night, sleep never came to me. I probably only slept for a couple of hours. I skipped my morning workout at the IMCA and staggered into the office, closed the door, and stared at the wall. I knew I needed to come up with a plan, a course of action. I needed to somehow figure out what was going on. I could have directly asked Sally what was going on. As far as I knew, she had never lied to me before. But if she's already hiding something, will she tell me the truth now? And how would I know this? I knew I had overheard. I knew what I saw in her eyes. I started doodling in my notebook and taking notes on what to do next. What steps to take to find out what's going on. But when it came to figuring out what to do if the worst-case scenario happened, I didn't know what to do. I loved Sally. I loved my children. The thought of losing them scared me to death. But even scarier was the thought that maybe Sally didn't really love me. For the next few days, I was like a zombie at work and at home. I couldn't think of anything else. Sally didn't even notice until Jason said something was wrong with Dad. I just said that I was thinking about some project at work. On Tuesday, I went back to my normal routine and went to play racquetball before work as usual. John was there, and of course Craig. I suddenly realized that I had never seen John without Craig and vice versa. I knew that if John was involved in something, then so was Craig. When I entered the locker room, they were standing at the end of one of the rows, changing clothes and talking quietly to each other. When they noticed me, John laughed and Craig grinned as if he knew something I didn't. I suddenly felt anger rising within me. For the first time, I began to think of them as my opponents. John was about an inch taller and 10 pounds heavier than me. Craig was a little shorter and stockier. I usually beat them at racquetball, mostly because I played longer and was in slightly better shape. I pulled myself together, and about 6 of us played a couple of matches. John and Craig were friendly, and we exchanged a few casual phrases before we all washed up and headed off to work. On Wednesday, I decided to try to find out where John and Craig would be on Saturday. I called John's home from work and spoke with his wife. Told her I'm one of the guys from his racquetball league and called to see if John could play on Saturday. She replied that she understood that he was going to a business conference in Detroit that afternoon and would be back on Sunday. When I heard this, my heart sank. I decided to call Craig's home and received the same answer from his wife. I slowly hung up the phone and stared out the window. Everything turned out to be true. It must be true. All 4 meet there. But the question remained, how far did it go? Anyway, this has gone too far. I was angry. I heard a little voice in my head saying, do something. On Friday evening after work, I went to see my mom and dad. His father had recently retired, and they planned to spend the winter in Florida. However, in anticipation of this, they spent a lot of time tidying up the house in case they found something suitable there. They also loved taking their grandchildren with them whenever they had the chance. I told them I needed to talk to them, and we sat at the kitchen table with iced tea while I tried to find the words. Finally, I sighed and said, I don't know how to say this, so I'll just say it straight out. I think Sally is cheating on me. As soon as I said this, tears started rolling down my face, and I almost sobbed. This was the first time I said something unthinkable out loud. Mom and Dad recoiled in shock. No, no, it can't be. Not Sally. Sally couldn't do that to you, Mom whispered. Son, why do you think that? The father asked quietly. I told them what I overheard and what I found out. Mom cried quietly and shook her head. Her father hugged her and hugged her tightly. What do you want from us, Phil? Dad asked. I need to know for sure. I need to be where they are tomorrow night. I know this is asking a lot, but could you take the kids tomorrow and keep them until Sunday? I begged. The father nodded. Of course, Phil, but I pray this turns out to be a misunderstanding. I nodded. Yes, me too. Thank you for doing this. I'll call you in the morning. I left feeling depressed. When I got home, Sally was busy around the house, finishing cooking dinner. She turned around when I entered the kitchen, put her arms around my neck, and kissed me. The kids are in the playroom and dinner will be ready in 20 minutes, she said happily. I could tell her thoughts were already on the upcoming weekend. She was literally beaming. It seemed that she was on the rise, almost as if under the influence of some kind of drugs. And by the way, I suddenly realized that we haven't made love since last Saturday. We missed our usual midweek session, probably due to my lousy mood this week, and I even took sleeping pills a few times to get me through the night. But Sally didn't remind her of this either. I wondered what she would say. Hesitantly, I said, Honey, I just realized that we haven't made love since last weekend, and you're leaving this weekend. How about we put the kids to bed early and spend some time together tonight? Sally pulled away from me and took a step back. I saw that veil in her eyes again, and her smile became forced. You know, Phil, I would love to, but my women's days started a little earlier, she said hesitantly. With no expression on my face, I said, Oh, of course I understand. She stroked my cheek and said seriously, I will definitely compensate you for everything, I promise. Okay? I barely restrained myself from pushing her hand away. Yes, we agreed, I muttered. She hugged me and happily went back to cooking. I slowly went upstairs to change clothes. Sally always had these as regular as clockwork when she took her pills. Now everything was clear. She's saving herself for a date tomorrow. If I had any doubts before, they are now gone. I felt angry, and a voice repeating, do something, was getting louder. It was not easy to hold back at dinner without showing all the emotions that I was experiencing. The children chatted as usual, but Sally was absorbed in her thoughts. Could this be our last family dinner? I looked away as tears welled up in my eyes at the thought. The next day, we followed our usual Saturday routine. The older children cleaned their rooms after breakfast. Ellie pretended to help. When they finished, they were allowed to watch cartoons. I pottered around in the garage until it was time for Sally to leave, and then I returned to the house. Sally was just coming down the stairs with her suitcase and yelling at the kids to behave while she was gone. Ellie followed her, shouting, "Buy me something, Mommy, buy me something." Sally stopped at the bottom of the stairs, set down her suitcase, and took Ellie into her arms, hugging and kissing her. "Of course, dear, just be good for Daddy." Sally handed Ellie to me, kissed me, and said, "I have to go. I have to pick up Debbie in 20 minutes. I nodded. "Don't forget to call me as soon as you get to the hotel." "What will you wear there?" She laughed and said, "I always call. This is the Red Roof Inn in Rochester Hills. Bye." And she walked out the door. I stood on the porch, holding Ellie in my arms, and watched her drive away without looking back. Once her car was out of sight, I slowly walked back into the house and yelled to Jace and Jesse. I had at least 2 hours before Sally would call to say she had arrived safely. Enough time to do what I have to do. They came downstairs, chatting and asking questions about why I had called them. I told them we were going to Grandma and Grandpa's for the night, so they needed to pack some things: pajamas, a change of clothes, and their favorite toys. After grumbling a little, they complied with my request and went back to their rooms. I helped Ellie pack her things, and we left the house and got into the car. Mom and Dad were waiting for us at the door when we arrived. I brought everyone into the house and helped them get settled. Before I left, I told my father, "Thank you, Dad. I hope I'm wrong." My father looked at me with concern. "Good luck, Phil. I hope you're wrong." I sighed. "Yes, I hope so too. Thank you for doing this. I'll call you in the morning." I went home through the airport. I went to Avis and changed my car. I didn't want anyone to recognize where I was going. A couple of hours later, I was sitting in the kitchen, staring at the clock. My brain kept replaying the events of the week in slow motion over and over again. When the phone finally rang a little after 1 p.m., I stared at it blankly before coming to my senses and picking it up. "Is that you, Phil?" I heard Sally's voice. "Yes, it's me." "You didn't even say hi. Are you okay?" "Yes, everything is fine. How are you doing?" I asked a little sarcastically. "I don't know what you mean by, how are we doing, but we got here safely. On the way we stopped for lunch. We're in room 168, and the phone number is 555-645-0168. We talked a little about small things, then she said, "Debbie is waving at me, I have to go. We're going to spend the day at the Meadowbrook Village Mall. See you tomorrow." And the telephone signal sounded when she hung up without waiting for my goodbye. I thought to myself, she didn't even say "I love you." And she didn't say that this morning when she left. I dialed the number I had previously found for the Red Roof Inn and asked to be connected to the reservations department. I asked if Sally Robinson had registered yet. They told me that yes, she had registered and offered to connect me with her number. I said that this was not necessary since I would see her later. I hung up and then dialed the same number again. This time I asked if John Harrison had checked in. They told me yes, but he hasn't stopped by yet. I said I would call back later and hung up. I sat staring at the phone, trying to suppress the anger that threatened to develop into violent rage. It was a scary feeling that I hadn't experienced in many years. I stood up and slowly walked down to my workshop, opened the lock on the gun cabinet door, and stood looking at my dad's old 16-gauge shotgun, a model 73.306 Winchester, and an old air rifle I used as a kid. My dad gave me his gun when he and my mom decided to retire last year. I had purchased a Winchester previously when I had been deer hunting for several years. I could no longer bear the thought of going hunting again after Vietnam. I stood there, lost in thought. I knew that if I took the gun with me, I might never see my children again. I leaned down and opened the bottom drawer, pulling out an old, beat-up shoebox from the corner. I lifted the box upstairs and dumped its contents onto the kitchen table. I sorted through things until I found what I was looking for. I pulled out the kabar knife I bought in Bangkok, bent down, lifted my pant leg, and tied the knife to my calf, then closed it again. I packed a few things I might need: driving gloves, a bottle of water, and a couple of chocolates. It was after 2 when I got behind the wheel to begin the 90-mile drive to Rochester Hills. I carefully pulled into the Red Roof Inn parking lot and drove slowly along the building until I got to room 168. I didn't see Sally's car, so I parked a few rows behind her room, turned off the engine, and waited. I didn't want to, but I kept thinking and remembering about Sally and the children. It was after 5 when a new red pickup truck that I recognized pulled up. John and Craig got out of the car. They looked quite happy, laughing and talking. They took out several suitcases and a refrigerator from the trunk and entered the next room. About 45 minutes later, they came out again and got into the pickup truck. I followed them for a few miles until they pulled into the parking lot of a bar called Tapper's Pub. I stopped on the street and watched them go inside. I then slowly drove around the parking lot and almost immediately noticed Sally's car. I parked on the street where I could see both the front door and John's red pickup truck. I thought about going inside, but the bar seemed small and I was afraid of being noticed. I sat listening to an old country music station and an endless string of songs about failed relationships. It suited my mood. It was after 9 when they finally left the bar, laughing and joking and holding hands. Instead of trying to keep an eye on them, I decided to return to the hotel earlier. At this time of night, I didn't think they would go anywhere else, and standing where I was, I could easily get onto the road before they did. I parked in front of their rooms again with the windows open about 10 minutes before the pickup and Sally's car pulled into the lot. All 4 of them came out and stood in front of number 168, talking. I was close enough to see them clearly in the light above the door, but far enough away that I couldn't hear what they were saying except for the occasional burst of laughter. They seemed to be having a nice argument about something. A few minutes later, John, with great fanfare, pulled the coin out of his pocket, threw it into the air, caught it, and, opening his palm in front of everyone, showed which side it fell. Some of them exclaimed joyfully, others sighed in disappointment, after which Craig pulled Sally towards him and kissed her. Smiling, Debbie took John's hand and pulled him into another room. With an embrace, both couples walked cheerfully into their separate rooms, turning to point and wave to each other. I sat stunned. Who was with whom? What kind of game is this? My head was racing with furious thoughts, the realization of what was probably going on in room 168, and the voice I had been hearing all week was getting louder, screaming, "Do something, anything." Do what? It was obvious that this was not the first time. They were too relaxed with each other. I couldn't take back what Sally had already done. 10 years, 10 years of marriage and starting a family. She crapped all of this and crap on me. What's the difference now? I think I knew the answer to this question. At least I'd sleep better knowing I tried. At that moment, John came out of Debbie's room, wearing only boxers and a t-shirt. He had a bottle of beer in his hands. I looked at my watch and suddenly realized that I had been staring at their door for over an hour. John looked around the building to make sure no one was watching, and then walked confidently up to Sally's room and knocked on the door twice. A couple of minutes later, Craig came out of the room, dressed in jeans, shirtless and barefoot. He closed the door behind him. They talked for a few minutes while John sipped his beer. They then slapped each other's hands, and this time John went into Sally's room and Craig went to Debbie's. It suddenly dawned on me what had just happened. I'm furious. Suddenly, a voice started screaming in my head, "Do something, idiot." I felt a fury come over me that I could no longer contain. I found my driving gloves on the seat next to me and pulled them on. I deliberately got out of the car and quickly walked to number 168. I closed the peephole with my left thumb and knocked twice with my right hand. "How long has this been going on, John?" I hissed. "Don't lie to me now," I added coldly. 2 or 2, maybe 2 years, he muttered, his voice and eyes expressing fear. So joining the same racquetball league wasn't a coincidence, John? I asked. No, no, he said hoarsely, closing his eyes again in pain. I thought about it, realizing that he wanted to be close to the man whose wife he slept with. You're a sick bastard, John. Look at me, John. If I ever hear you approach Sally or any other married woman, I will find you. Do you understand me? Do you understand? I repeated when he hesitated. Yes, he finally said with a wheeze. Actually, you better go far away, very far away, I said. At that moment, the water in the shower stopped flowing, and I heard the curtain being drawn. Sally's voice came from the bathroom. Hey, John boy, I thought you were going to take a shower with me. What's happening? And she giggled. I looked up just as the bathroom door opened and Sally appeared in the doorway. She was holding a towel and drying her hair when suddenly she saw me. Her eyes opened wide and she gasped, her face turning chalk white. The towel fell to the floor and her mouth opened. She tried to say something. Her body went into shock. John boy seems incapacitated, I growled. Her face contorted with panic, and she stepped back, slamming the door with both hands and locking it. I turned and walked over to the bedside table. I picked up the phone, cut the cord with one swipe of the knife, and then put the knife back in its sheath. I turned and headed towards the front door. I stopped at the door and looked around the room again. I suddenly screamed in frustration and pain, then swung my hand hard and threw the phone straight through the bathroom door with as much force as I could muster. The phone hit the door with a bang and fell to the floor. I went outside and closed the door behind me. I stopped for a moment and realized that the work was not finished yet. I walked over to another hotel room. Again, I closed the peephole with my left thumb and tapped twice with my right hand. The door opened and Craig started laughing and saying, "You guys are so loud." I heard a short cry from the bed and looked at Debbie sitting at the head of the bed, her eyes like saucers, her shaking hands holding the sheet under her chin. I stood up and headed to the bedside table. Debbie let go of the sheet, and it fell around her waist as she pressed her shaking hands to her face, looking at me with fear. "Nice breasts, Debbie," I said, looking down at her. Then I took the phone and with a sharp movement pulled the cord out of the wall. I walked back to the door and turned to look at her again. "If you ever tell your husband you met me tonight, tell him I said hi," I said sarcastically. Then, changing his mind, he added, "Or maybe I'll tell him myself." I threw the phone into the corner of the room, then walked out, closing the door behind me. I stood outside, looking up at the night sky and taking a deep breath of the cool air. I felt the tension disappear, giving way to a calming fatigue. The do-something voice disappeared. It was done, and I knew what else I had to do. The only thing I could do. I walked purposefully to the car to begin the rest of my life. "Yes," I said into the phone somewhat sharply. I was irritated by the interruption, although I had been expecting it all day. I was deep in thought about Jason, Jesse, and Ellie. Now they were the most important part of my life, and the top priority became protecting them from the consequences of what happened. "Phil, this is Jack." "Yes, Jack," I answered without enthusiasm. "What's going on there?" When Emily and I returned from church, Sally was at our house, crying and saying she was afraid to go home. Jack said decisively, almost shouting. I looked at my watch. It was almost 1 o'clock in the afternoon, almost 14 hours after I had left Rochester Hills. "I don't know what I could have done to make her feel this way," I said calmly. "She says you were violent towards a couple of Debbie's friends that the two of them ran into last night. I offended them greatly. Hurted them. They're lucky I didn't kill them," I said sarcastically. "Phil, what the hell? This is not like you." I wondered for a minute how to respond to this statement. Finally, I just asked my question. "Did Sally tell you where that fight happened?" "She said it was outside a restaurant near Rochester Hills." So she tried to spin it. "Well, her family, her story. Sally is your daughter, so I guess it's true," I said slowly. There was silence on the phone, and I could feel Jack trying to process it all. "Phil, I'm going to take Sally home. I want to know what's going on. We need to talk. No problem. I wasn't planning on going anywhere. Jack hung up abruptly, but not before I heard in the background, "No, Daddy, no," I sighed. I thought it would be difficult for her. I was sitting at the kitchen table, looking at old photos and mementos that were in my shoebox, and working on my second beer when they arrived. Jack walked into the kitchen with Sally behind him tugging at his arm. "Please, Daddy, let's figure this out. Phil and I need some time alone." I looked closely at Sally. She had no makeup, her hair was down, her eyes were red and swollen. She was trembling as if she had a severe nervous breakdown. She refused to return my gaze, holding her father's hand and trying to guide him back to the door. But Jack refused to be controlled. Jack sat down in front of the kitchen table and stared at me. He silently looked at me and at the ka-bar knife lying on the table next to my beer. Finally, he said, "Okay, Phil, what's happening?" I looked at Sally and said mockingly, "Yes, Sally, tell your father what's going on." She turned to me and said furiously, "Shut up, Phil. You and I can fix this," her voice commanded, but her eyes pleaded with me. I was angry that I thought everything could be fixed if we were left alone, or that she thought she could manipulate me. I decided to be as honest as she was lying, and it was she who dragged her parents into this. I looked Jack straight in the eyes. It turns out that Sally and her boss Debbie had a couple of playmates that they liked to get together with when they were out of town. I found out about this and objected. Quite harsh, I must admit. I said this more tactfully than she deserved. Sally gasped, backed away, and sat down on one of the kitchen chairs. Jack looked at me incredulously. "No, Phil, Sally wouldn't do that. I don't believe you." I thought about it for a minute, then turned to Sally and said, "Take off your clothes, Sally." "What? What?" she said in confusion. "You heard me. What's the matter? Your father has seen you without clothes before. It doesn't shock him." Sally just looked at me incredulously and didn't move. Jack just shook his head, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. I shrugged and said, "Okay, Sally. How about this? Take off your blouse, just your blouse, nothing else." Sally didn't move again, but the same frightened expression appeared on her face. Jack started getting angry at me and said, "That's enough, Phil. Now you are being cruel and disrespectful." I looked from Sally to Jack and back to Sally. I felt the anger overcome my feelings of pain and sadness. "Cruel and disrespectful, you say? Not even close, Jack. I'll tell you what it is to be cruel and disrespectful. If Sally had taken off her clothes, you would have seen what I saw in her hotel room last night, marks left by another man," I said in a voice devoid of emotion. Jack quickly turned around and looked at Sally. It was obvious from Sally's horrified expression that I was telling the truth. Suddenly, Jack collapsed into his chair as if his spine could no longer support him. Jack's expression crumpled as he covered his face with his hands and whispered, "Oh God, this will kill your mother." Sally turned pale and her eyes began to cry. "Please, Daddy, don't tell Mommy. We'll get through this. Phil, right? Please, Phil, please," she begged. I sat in silence, rearranging old photographs and fiddling around with souvenirs from his old shoebox, remembering another time when I was in incredible pain. After a few minutes, Jack straightened up and wiped his eyes. He looked at me without expression. "What are you going to do, Phil?" he asked as tears continued to stream down Sally's face. I sat and pondered this question for several minutes. Finally, I said slowly, "I never told any of you about Vietnam or ripcord." I sighed. "Damn, I never told anyone about ripcord, even to your therapist." I waved my hand at the pile of things on the table. "Isn't it ironic, Jack, that your generation hangs your war memorabilia on your mantle for display and admiration, while my generation puts our mementos in a shoebox and hides them at the bottom of the drawer? Why?" I said rhetorically. I picked up a faded photo of two tanned, lean young guys, bareheaded, wearing baggy jungle uniforms and dog tags around their necks, smiling at the camera as if Vietnam were a Boy Scout on a walk. Have I ever been this young? I definitely felt old. I threw the photo on the table between Jack and Sally and began to talk conversationally, as if I were talking or maybe even lecturing to strangers. Jace and I were sent to Ripcord Base in May 1971. This was one of many fire bases where our battery was assigned in Vietnam. We spent 6 months there, and the same amount remained before returning home. However, this time everything was different. We landed on an empty hill surrounded by dense jungle above the Ashao Valley near the border with Laos. This place was known to be very dangerous for the American Army and had previously seen fierce battles with heavy casualties. Ripcord AFP was created to support battalions of the 101st Airborne Division, which were combing the mountains on both sides of the valley in an attempt to thwart the North Vietnamese Army. The base consisted of our battery of howitzers, a mortar platoon, and a company of infantry. In total, there were no more than 400 of us. Almost the entire base was underground in bunkers and trenches. Later, we learned that we were surrounded by enemy forces tens of times greater than ours. I looked at Jack and said, "Does this remind you of something, Jack? How are your Marines at Chosin Reservoir?" Jack nodded, lost in thought. At the beginning, everything went relatively calmly, but on July 1st, the situation worsened sharply. For the first time, they started firing at us from mortars. The shelling became more and more intense, and by the end, we were receiving dozens of shells a day, suffering serious losses. We were constantly busy supporting the infantry, and our howitzers worked non-stop. One day, a Chinook delivering ammunition was shot down, causing a fire and many casualties. We were all shocked. I looked at Jace with tears in my eyes. When the Chinook crashed, we ran to help the wounded. "I will never forget this," I whispered. The shelling and attacks continued, and one night Jace, my best friend, was killed. This was the moment when I felt truly alone. After some time, I was seriously wounded and was evacuated from the base. The next day, the decision was made to evacuate Ripcord, and everyone was taken out and the base was bombed. I was sent to a hospital in Japan and then to Walter Reed. For my participation in hostilities, I was awarded a medal, but its significance for me was already different. I shook my head, but I wasn't okay. Not psychologically, at least. Every night I had nightmares and woke up screaming. I couldn't get rid of the images that constantly appeared in my head. I missed Jace's funeral, but made it home on leave before I was sent to Fort Sill. The first thing I did was visit Jace's parents. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. They wanted to know everything about Vietnam, what we did there, and how Jace died. But the only question they didn't ask was, why did I survive and he didn't? I stopped and quietly added, "That's the same question I ask myself almost every day." I stared into space, remembering this dark period in my life. I was in therapy, but I still felt like I was withdrawing from the world. I didn't want to see anyone or talk to anyone. I did the bare minimum to keep everyone around Fort Sill happy. I got lost in my studies, taking drawing classes in college so I wouldn't have to socialize with other kids in the evenings. When the time came to leave the army, I returned home to my parents and continued my studies. Not because I was interested in it, but because I didn't know what else to do. I raised my eyes and looked at Sally, and all the pain, resentment, and despair from last night came rushing back to me, almost blinding. "And then I met Sally," I whispered. She covered her mouth with her hand, holding back a sob, lowered her gaze, and did not dare look at me. "You brought me back to the real world. You were happy, genuinely interested in everyone around you, and you were beautiful, both inside and out. You were everything I wasn't, and you made me want to know you. You made me want to live again, gave me a vision of what my life could be, and I fell in love with you. You saved me. You gave me 3 wonderful children. For this, I will always be grateful to you," I said sadly. We sat in silence, without moving, for several minutes. Finally, Jack cleared his throat and asked quietly, "What now, Phil?" Tired, I turned my head and looked at him. "Jack, I have been betrayed twice in my life, and both times I lost my best friend," I answered simply. Sally buried her face in her hands and began to sob, whispering, "No, no, no." We sat quietly, Sally sobbing, and Jack and I had tears in our eyes. Jack said quietly, "Are you sure, Phil? Do you want to give up everything because of one mistake?" A ray of desperate hope flashed in Sally's eyes. I knew that what I had to say would destroy our marriage, but I couldn't let the lie go unanswered. I shook my head and looked at him. "One mistake, Jack. It wasn't just one mistake. I found out last night that Sally has been cheating on me for almost 2 years, and it wasn't with just one man." Sally gasped, closed her eyes, shook her head in despair, and sank limply in her chair, becoming even paler than before. I looked at her curiously. "John didn't tell you, Sally, that he confessed everything?" I turned to Jack. "Does this answer your question?" I said. Jack slowly stood up and, looking sadly at Sally, said, "You are my daughter, and I must love you. But I've lost all respect for you, your behavior." Jack stopped, unable to find words, and simply shook his head. Sally reached out to him, wanting to touch him, but he pulled away. He turned to me and said firmly, "Phil, you don't deserve this. Do what you think is necessary, but please don't hurt her. I couldn't stand it." "No, Jack, I think I'm out of this state," I said sadly. "But if it makes you feel better, take this with you." I put the knife back in its sheath and handed it to him. Jack accepted it silently and headed for the door. His shoulders slumped. He must have been wondering how to tell Emily about this. When the door closed behind him, the phone rang, but neither of us paid attention to it. We just sat there, not moving, not talking or looking at each other. Finally, the call stopped, and the silence became even more oppressive. "Finally," I said, staring at one point, "I expected the police to come this morning, not your father." Sally winced and stammered. Me and Debbie, talked them into making up a story about being attacked outside a bar. We were hoping that if everything was quiet, you wouldn't call their wives." I thought about it for a moment and realized that I was out of danger. They will no longer be able to change their history and stay alive. For a second, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders until I remembered everything else was collapsing around me. I just chuckled and asked, "Where are they now?" Sally cleared her throat and began to fidget nervously in her chair. "They are still in the hospital for examination." She hesitated for a moment, then asked, her voice trembling, "I've never seen you so cruel, Phil. Was it necessary to do this?" I looked at her in bewilderment. "Are you protecting these bastards?" I asked sarcastically. Before she could answer, the phone rang again. "You have to answer, it's probably you," I said and went to the bathroom. I washed my face and looked at my reflection in the mirror. The eyes were red and swollen. I looked the way I felt, old and haggard, older than my years. I didn't sleep for almost the whole night. I returned to the kitchen. Sally just stood there, holding the phone in her hand and looking at it. Slowly, she hung up the phone and collapsed back into one of the kitchen chairs. When I sat down again, she said, without looking at me, "Did you have to? Should I have told Debbie's husband?" I shrugged. Why not share the pain? He already called John and Craig's wives, and he kicked Debbie out of the house. Now she will have to hire a lawyer to see her daughter. She started crying again, muttering, "Damn, damn, damn." She looked at me with tears on her face, and she fired me. She said that it was all my fault. I laughed bitterly. "Well, that's just wonderful. Tell me, Sally, who introduced you to John and Craig? It was Debbie, wasn't it?" Sally said, sobbing, "How? How did you know?" "When I told Josh this morning what you and Debbie did last night, he didn't want to believe it. Called me a liar and accused me of trying to ruin his marriage. But as soon as I mentioned John Harrison's name, he changed. He turned pale like a ghost and began to curse like a sailor. I think it was probably the first time in his life that he got angry. You told me years ago that this was Debbie's second marriage and that she was at odds with her parents. It seems Debbie has a sister living somewhere in the north, with whom she barely communicates. About a year ago, Josh was auditing a company in the area and one of the employees turned out to be Sarah, Debbie's sister. Sarah knew Debbie had remarried and Josh knew Debbie had a sister, but they had never met. They hit it off, and one evening, before the audit was completed, Sarah invited him to dinner with her and her husband, Dave. Sarah turned out to have an interesting story. It turns out that her husband Dave was Debbie's first husband. Dave and Debbie started dating in college. They dated for 2 years until Debbie graduated from university and then got married. Around their first anniversary, Dave found out that Debbie was cheating on him. He also found out that she had been deceiving him throughout their entire relationship. He kicked her out and filed for divorce. Debbie had a fight with her parents over this. Dave and Sarah then started dating and eventually got married. They now have 2 children and seem happy. Of course, Debbie never told Josh about any of this. Now guess who Debbie cheated on her first husband with? Surprise, it was John Harrison. I stopped and Sally looked at me in shock. Oh yeah, so when I mentioned John's name, Josh started putting the puzzle together and realized that Debbie had been doing to him the same thing you've done to me throughout their entire marriage. No wonder he kicked her out onto the street. And like Josh, I wonder how long you've been deceiving me, I said with a venomous tone. Sally started crying again and said through her tears, "Oh God, Phil, it was only John and Craig, and only during our shopping trips. Believe me, I never even thought about anyone else until Debbie started talking about it before our first trip." She sat twisting the handkerchief in her fingers, alternating between tears and pleas. "Please, Phil, I don't know how I ended up in this position. I felt like I woke up from some kind of dream, or maybe a nightmare, when I opened the bathroom door and saw you there." I didn't say a word, I just looked at her sternly. Having gained some courage, she began to speak faster, almost incoherently. I knew Debbie liked to have fun before we even started shopping. She talked about it as the most fun thing she had ever done in her marriage. But I didn't expect her to find someone on our trip. I was completely surprised when John showed up at the restaurant and Debbie introduced him to me. She explained that she had known John since school and that he happened to be in the area. I suspected that this was not the case, but I didn't say anything. She stopped, bit her lip, and turned away. John was on his charm that night. He flirted, danced with both of us, and constantly complimented me. I drank a couple more glasses than I was used to. Later, when we returned to the hotel, Debbie went with John. He booked a room next to ours. I then realized that all this was planned. "I guess that explains why you were so passionate when you got home on Sunday, doesn't it?" I said with contempt. Sally lowered her head and nodded. She wiped her eyes and continued, "John left the next morning. We went to breakfast and Debbie told me in detail about her night with him. She praised him all the way home. Over the next few months, as usual, Debbie and I ate lunch together at work several times a week. She mentioned John often and said how much fun she had with him and how great the sex was. Debbie laughed and said I should try it at least once because she couldn't explain it in words. At first, I just laughed it off. But the more she talked about it, the more this idea settled in my head. A few months later, when the opportunity arose to go shopping again, Debbie admitted that John was very interested in being with me and that she would not mind if I wanted to spend time with him. I kind of laughed at this, but still asked her what she would do if I agreed. She said John had a friend, Craig, who would join her. I didn't say yes or no, but I don't know why I didn't say no. I told her I'd think about it, although I wasn't sure I could decide to do it. Sally looked at me, but I just looked at her without expression. I knew it was wrong, Phil, but the idea got stuck in my head that I could do this and no one would know. Sally looked away again and said, "John and Craig showed up at the restaurant that Saturday night. We had dinner, had a few drinks, and then went to a nightclub. We sort of split into pairs, and I was with John. By that time, I had already drunk enough and convinced myself that nothing bad would happen. Everyone was having fun. Later, when we got back to the hotel, I went to my room with John, and Debbie and Craig went to another room." Sally fell silent and stared at her hands. Finally, I sarcastically asked, "So, Was it everything you hoped for? Sally looked at me through her tears. It, it was normal. No better than you and me. The fun was that it was wrong. It was someone new, and I could pretend I was someone else. So you want to say that it was even better than normal, that you forgot about your husband who was waiting for you at home. Your husband who took care of your children out of love for you, so that you could spend this time alone, I said bitterly. Sally choked back a sob and turned away again. Yes, she whispered. How do you explain Craig, my wife? I asked sarcastically. Without looking at me, she replied, after a few trips with John, Debbie joked that she was starting to miss him. I didn't think too much about it, but on the next trip, when we paired up again, I danced most of the night with Craig. Later, at the hotel, Craig came to my room and we spent the night together. It didn't seem like a big deal. Then, after a few trips, John and Craig switched places in the middle of the night. I didn't realize this at first until I woke up late at night and realized that the person was not the one I started the night with. Sally looked at me sadly. It seemed like I was two different people living in two different worlds. I loved our life together, you, me, and the children, but I was addicted to those weekends. I thought I could have it both ways, and you'd never know. How stupid I was. Yes, indeed, stupid, I agreed. But after you saw me at the hotel, I looked at myself in the mirror and realized who I had become, she whispered, as if to herself. I stood up and looked at her. Interesting story, Sally. It's a shame it doesn't have a happy ending. Or maybe there is one for you. I'll go get the children. Tonight, after Ellie is asleep, you and I will sit down with Jason and Jesse and tell them that their parents will be living apart. I think Ellie is too young to understand this. We won't tell them the real reason, and I will do everything I can to minimize the trauma for them. I'll sleep on the couch in the basement until I can find another place. Sally screamed as I started to walk away. Phil, my God, it was a mistake. I love you. Don't do this, please. I turned around and said, why don't I do it? Sally said, sobbing, it was only 3 or 4 nights a year. I never saw John and Craig or anyone else outside of those weekends. Please, Phil, I beg you, can't you forgive me and let me make things right? Forgive you, Sally? Should I forgive you for 3 or 4 nights a year when you became a woman of easy virtue for other men? Because you gave away what I valued most in the world, you. Forgive me for destroying my trust in you. Forgive me for destroying my faith that we belong to each other and no one else, I said sadly. How are you going to fix everything? Can you go back in time and start over? You won't sleep with John this time, and you won't sleep with Craig, because that's what it will take to fix everything, I said tiredly. I stood silently, looking around the kitchen, where family photographs hung, children's drawings and papers were attached to the refrigerator. Ellie's baby chair stood in the corner, everything that made this house cozy. I shook my head, trying to get rid of the surging thoughts. I spent most of last night awake, thinking about how I would feel about you in 6 months, in a year, or in 5 years. I'm sure I can forgive you someday. What I can't do is forget. Not in a year, not in 5 years, not in 10. Every time I see you, I will remember last night. Every time I hear your voice, I will remember last night. And every time I hear your name, I will remember last night, I said with trembling in the voice. With tears in my eyes, I added, this is something I can't live with, Sally. I stood motionless, sadly contemplating the future, barely aware of Sally, who rocked back and forth in her chair, alternately sobbing and whispering, no, please, God, no. After a few minutes, I quietly asked, can you answer one question for me, Sally? She looked up at me with a look of complete emptiness, like that of a person sentenced to death who knows that his sentence will not be changed. You lost the person who loved you more than anyone in the world. You have lost your parents' respect, my parents' respect, and your husband's respect. You lost your job. And one day you will have to explain to our children why you destroyed our family. Was it worth it? After a minute, broken only by Sally's quiet sobs, I turned and slowly walked out the door. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think. Click to the next one. Click to the next one. Click to the next one. Click to the next one.